The woman arrived on a Tuesday, which was the sort of detail Eleanor Ashby noticed and filed without comment, the way she filed most details at Thornfield Park. She had been filing details at Thornfield for 5 years. The condition of the south hedgerow in November. The particular way the east chimney smoked when the wind came from the north. The names of all 17 tenant families and which of them paid their rents on time not from obligation, but from pride. And which of them needed a quiet latitude extended in September when the harvest had been poor. She knew the age of every fence post on the property. She knew which fields drained and which did not, and what had to be done in February to prevent the latter from becoming the former. She had learned all of this not because anyone had taught her, but because the estate had required a person to know it, and she had been the person present. Tuesday meant the weekly accounts had just been settled. Tuesday meant old Birch had already gone home to his cottage, with the week's wages, and would not be back until Thursday. Tuesday meant the drawing-room fire was burning low, because the household lit it fully only on Wednesdays when deliveries came. And Eleanor had not given the order to build it up because she had not known, until the carriage turned through the park gates, that there would be anyone worth warming the room for. She stood at the tall drawing-room window and watched the carriage approach along the frost-hardened gravel drive. The vehicle was very fine. The horses were bay, matched, and their breath clouded in the December air. The woman who stepped out wore dove-gray silk and a cashmere shawl that cost more than Eleanor spent on the household linen for a full quarter. She moved with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had never been required to hurry. Eleanor had not been given her name. Wentworth's letter, which had arrived the day before, had not supplied it. The letter had supplied other things. A set of instructions about which rooms were to be prepared. A note that certain furniture in the east wing was to be left exactly as it stood, and the information that a guest of particular importance would be arriving Tuesday to take a first survey of the property. Eleanor had read the letter twice. She had understood it completely. She had placed it in the small locked drawer of her writing desk, where she kept the documents she did not want the household to find by accident. She crossed the hallway herself to open the front door. The footman, young Samuel, was already moving, but she passed him with a quiet gesture and took the door herself because the threshold of Thornfield Park was still hers to answer. The woman stopped on the top step and looked at Eleanor with a composed, assessing expression that was not unkind. It was the expression of a person who has arrived at a place they expect to own and is making a preliminary inventory. "Mrs. Ashby," she said. She knew the name. "Yes," Eleanor said. "And you are Mrs. Vane?" She had guessed. The name had not been given, but there had been a letter in Wentworth's coat pocket 2 summers ago. Half seen when she had taken the coat to be brushed, and the handwriting had been a woman's, and she had not permitted herself to look further. Some knowledge, once fully admitted, could not be managed. She had chosen to manage. Mrs. Vane's expression shifted by a fraction. She had not expected to be known. "I hope I have not arrived at an inconvenient hour," she said, with the particular politeness of someone who does not believe in inconvenient hours, only in the absence of adequate preparation. "Not at all," Eleanor said. "Please come in." She had been 5 years at Thornfield by that December. She had arrived as a bride of 22, a clergyman's daughter from a Lincolnshire parish, with 3 dresses suitable for company, a small income of her own that had seemed adequate for a country life, and the reasonable expectation that a husband who had courted her for 2 seasons with apparent warmth was a husband who found her worth the courting. She had learned within the first year that Wentworth had needed the income and had needed a wife who would not make excessive demands on his attention, and that she had satisfied both requirements precisely because she had believed she was marrying for the conventional reasons and had not thought to look behind the arrangement for its actual mechanics. She had not wept over it for long. Weeping was a luxury that required an audience, and Wentworth had returned to London within 8 weeks of the wedding, and thereafter appeared at Thornfield for approximately 6 weeks of each year, generally in August and occasionally at Christmas. The rest of the time, Eleanor ran the estate. She ran it because it required running, and because no one else was going to do it, and because the 17 tenant families on the Thornfield lands could not wait on Wentworth's convenience or her own grief. To the season, she was just the caretaker wife. That was what they called her in the district, the Ashby acquaintances who passed through and who described her to others in London, to Wentworth's circle, to anyone who asked what manner of woman Sir Wentworth had chosen. She had heard it first from Wentworth's own mouth. One evening in the drawing-room, when a friend had called and she had been present for the first quarter hour before, quietly excusing herself. "Eleanor is the caretaker wife," Wentworth had said, and she had heard him from the hallway, his voice easy and affectionate as he spoke to Mrs. Vane, though she had not known then that the low female laugh that followed was Mrs. Vane's. "She keeps the linen pressed and the books balanced. She does not interest herself in the larger arrangements." She had stood in the hallway for a moment, with her hand flat against the plaster wall. Then she had gone upstairs and sat at her writing desk and opened the estate accounts to the Eastfield drainage column, which had been troubling her for weeks. The caretaker wife kept the books. The caretaker wife knew, therefore, that Thornfield Park's freehold title was not something Wentworth could casually dispose of. And the caretaker wife had, some 8 months prior to Mrs. Vane's Tuesday arrival, consulted with Mr. Daria, Aldous Peel at his office in the village and then again by private appointment at the house, and had exercised an instrument she had discovered buried in the original marriage settlement, a clause inserted by her late father's solicitor and apparently overlooked by Wentworth's, that permitted the wife to act as sole trustee of any settled property in the husband's prolonged absence, defined as greater than 60 days in any calendar year. Wentworth had not spent 60 consecutive days at Thornfield in 3 years. Eleanor had signed the freehold into a charitable trust in March. She had done it quietly, at 9 in the morning, with Mr. Gree, Peel as witness and no one else present. And she had placed the document in the locked drawer with Wentworth's letter, and she had gone out to see about the drainage ditch in the East Field. And she had not told anyone. Mrs. Bashan. Vane's arrival did not change this. It clarified certain things that had been suspended in abstraction. If the channel you find yourself returning to is one that follows stories like Eleanor's, there is more to see. Eleanor settled Mrs. Vane in the blue sitting room with tea, and the kind of correct, unhurried hospitality she had spent 5 years perfecting. She answered questions about the house with precise and pleasant information. She showed the guests the east wing, the morning room, the library, the terrace view over the park. She did not show her the locked drawer. She did not mention the trust documents. She did not say the word. She was carefully not saying, which was already, because everything that needed to be done had already been done. It was the following morning that Eleanor rode to Calloway Hall. She went because James Calloway was one of the 3 trustees named in the Thornfield settlement documents. She had chosen him not from sentiment but from the evident fact that he was a man of legal training, who would not be intimidated by a baronet's displeasure, and who had sufficient property of his own to have no interest in Wentworth's goodwill. She had not, in the 8 months since the signing, had occasion to speak with him in any detail about the arrangement, though he had signed his own trustee papers without comment or question, returned them through Mr. Crand. Peel, and had not raised the matter at the 2 district dinners at which they had both been present. She found him in the yard behind Calloway Hall, inspecting the axle of a farm cart with his steward. He looked up when she rode in. He did not look startled. He had, she had always noticed, a particular quality of attention when he looked at her, deliberate and level, without the reflexive assessment that most men performed on women of her age and situation. He was not weighing her against a scale. She couldn't see. He was simply looking. "Mrs. Ashby," he said. He handed the wheel rim back to the steward and came toward her, without any appearance of hurry. "Mr. Calloway." Quote. She dismounted herself before his groom could reach her. She had always dismounted herself. "I need to speak with you about the Thornfield Trust. Something has occurred that makes it relevant sooner than I anticipated." He did not ask her what had occurred. He simply said, "Come inside," and turned toward the house, and she followed. They sat in his library, which was floor-to-ceiling books and a fire that had been burning long enough to warm the room properly. A housekeeper brought tea and set it between them, and withdrew. Eleanor poured because there was tea to pour, and because her hands were steady and she wanted them to have something to do. She told him about Mrs. Vane and the letter, and Wentworth's intention. She told him clearly, and without embellishment, the way she told him things she needed him to understand. She was aware, as she spoke, of the particular quality of the room's warmth and the particular quality of his attention, which had always had the effect of making her feel that what she was saying was worth the saying. Most people, when they listened, were preparing their response. He was actually listening. She had noticed this about him in their first year of proximity, and had filed it with the other things she noticed about Calloway and did not permit herself to examine. He listened without interrupting. When she had finished, he was quiet, for a moment. "He does not know about the trust," he said. "No, he will discover it. Yes, when he arrives and attempts to transfer the title." He looked at her. The crease between his brows deepened slightly, not with displeasure, but with the particular quality of attention that meant he was calculating something. "You have protected the tenants," he said. "I have protected the tenants." "And yourself." She had not mentioned herself. She met his gaze and felt the thing she always felt in his immediate company, which was a warmth at the back of her throat that she had been carefully disregarding for 4 years, because warmth of that kind had nowhere to go and served no purpose. "The trust secures the property," she said. "I am not party to it in any personal capacity." He understood what she was saying. She saw him understand it. She had signed away the estate and secured nothing for herself in return, because securing something for herself would have required retaining a controlling interest she did not believe she had the right to hold. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. The crease between his brows present, the quality of his attention concentrated in a way that made her pulse do something inconvenient in her wrists. She knew precisely where he was in the room, without needing to confirm it with her eyes. This had been true of him for 4 years. She had not examined why. He looked away, toward the fire. "I will be available," he said. When Sir Wentworth arrives, she had not asked him to be. She said, "Thank you," and stood, and he stood, and the distance between them was approximately 4 feet across the library hearthrug, and she felt the warmth of the fire on her left side, and the warmth of being seen on the right, and she did not permit herself to name what that second warmth was. She did not need to name it. The body had already named it some years ago, and had simply been waiting for the circumstance to change. 3 days later, he saw her in the East Field. He had been riding the eastern boundary to check the new fencing his steward had ordered, and he had taken the path along the drainage ditch because it was the most direct, and he came around the hawthorn stand at the ditch's corner and saw her before she could see him. She was kneeling in the wet grass at the ditch's near edge. The light was the low, flat light of December at 3 in the afternoon, which made everything look like it was already becoming a memory. Old Birch was sitting against the bank with his back against the frozen earth, his face tight with pain, and Eleanor was in the ditch, her gloves off, her hands in the cold mud, shifting the blockage that had formed in the outlet pipe. Her gray-green spencer was smeared at the cuffs. Her hair had come loose at one temple. She was not asking Birch to direct her. She knew where the blockage was. She had found it herself. She worked with the efficiency of someone who has done this before, which she had. Because the East Ditch had a habit of blocking at the third outlet in November, and she had cleared it herself the prior 2 years as well, on both occasions without mentioning it to anyone. Calloway stopped his horse. He sat without speaking. She worked methodically, without drama, the way she did everything, and after 4 minutes the water moved and the pipe ran clear, and she sat back on her heels in the mud and looked at the old man with an expression that was entirely plain and satisfied, and contained no performance of satisfaction whatsoever. "There," she said. "We will have Mr. Birch look at the western outlet on Thursday, if you are able." "Aye, Mrs. Ashby," Birch said, and there was something in his voice that was not merely the deference of employee to employer. There was something that was closer to love. She accepted it without acknowledgement, which was how she accepted most things she did not know how to answer to without diminishing. She became aware of Calloway. Then she looked up. She was not embarrassed. She met his eyes across the ditch with the same level attention she had always used with him, and he nodded once, and she nodded, and he rode on. He rode on a long way before he stopped again at the eastern gate and sat for a moment with his horse still beneath him, and the flat December light on the frost-gray grass, and the knowledge settling into him very quietly, the way things settle when they have been waiting for a long time to be named. He came to Thornfield that evening on the pretext of returning a borrowed survey map. Eleanor received him in the small sitting room that looked over the kitchen garden, because the drawing-room fire had been let down again and Mrs. Vane had retired early, and Wentworth had not yet arrived. They sat on either side of the small table, and there was tea, and the map between them and the window behind him showed the darkness of the winter garden. She asked about the boundary fencing. He told her. Then there was a pause that had more texture than ordinary silence, and he reached into his coat pocket and took out a miniature and set it on the table between them. Not as an offering, but as a fact he had decided to name. The miniature showed a young woman with fair hair and a direct expression. Eleanor did not pick it up. "Anne," he said. He did not look at the miniature. He looked at the fire. "She died in February of 1814. We had been married 14 months. I had pressed for a journey she had not been well enough to make in cold weather, because I believed the air at her mother's house would restore her. I was wrong." He paused. "She was in labor for 31 hours. The child did not survive either." Eleanor said nothing. She knew that silence was sometimes the more respectful answer. "I have not," he said, "found it easy to be near people I might lose. It has seemed to me that the risk was not one I was entitled to take again." He picked up the miniature and held it. "I have been wrong about that too, I believe. It is simply the risk that follows from being alive. I did not understand that keeping my distance was not the same as keeping anyone safe. It was only the same as being absent. And I have paid for that particular misunderstanding, at length." He put the miniature back in his pocket and covered it with his hand for a moment, and then he lifted his hand. She looked at him then. The library fire was warm and the night outside was cold, and there was the miniature in his hand and his dark eyes across the small table, and she felt her pulse in the hollow of her throat, a small rapid beat that she had not asked for and could not quiet. "I am sorry about Anne," she said. He put the miniature back in his pocket and covered it with his hand for a moment, and then he lifted his hand. "I know," he said. She found when she went to bed that night that she could not easily account for the 4 feet of kitchen garden sitting room between them, why it had felt like both too much and exactly right. She found also that she was not afraid of it. She was only waiting. Wentworth arrived on Friday with a solicitor of his own, and a second carriage of luggage for Mrs. Vane, and by Friday evening the drawing-room at Thornfield was arranged as though Eleanor were a housekeeper who had been consulted on a room she did not know, she no longer occupied. Mrs. Vane sat in the chair nearest the fire. Wentworth stood by the window, with a glass of claret, and the expression of a man who has managed a complicated affair to its conclusion. He had not spoken to Eleanor privately. He had greeted her in the hall with the benign pleasantness of someone who expects no complication. She had returned the greeting with equal pleasantness. She had said nothing about the trust, at dinner with Mrs. Vane at his right hand, and Eleanor at his left, and no other company, because there had been no other invitation. Wentworth said in the same easy voice he used for all announcements, regardless of their content, "I have arranged for a full accounting of the Thornfield property to be conducted next week. My solicitor will need access to all the estate records. I trust you will make them available without difficulty." He was looking at Mrs. Vane when he said it, not at Eleanor. That was how she knew he was addressing her. He addressed her most directly when he was not looking at her. "Of course," she said. He did not notice the quality of her agreement. She sat through dinner with the steadiness of a woman who has spent 5 years preparing for a thing she was not certain would ever arrive. She ate the soup and the fish and the syllabub that cook had produced on short notice, and she made the expected remarks about the pheasant season and the state of the South Road. And she did not think about the documents in the locked drawer, and she did not think about James Calloway 3 miles away at Calloway Hall with a miniature in his breast pocket, and a crease between his brows, and a way of looking at her that had never once felt like assessment. She thought about Anne. She thought about a woman she had never met who had died in February in a cold room and had not deserved it, and who had somehow produced in the man who loved her a grief so specific and human that it had made him, finally, real to Eleanor in a way that careful observation over 4 years had not quite accomplished. She excused herself at the first reasonable moment. She went upstairs to the room that had been hers for 5 years, which was a smaller room than the one Wentworth occupied when he was in residence, a choice she had made in the first month because the smaller room looked over the kitchen garden and she had always preferred to see something growing from her window. She sat at the writing desk without lighting a lamp and looked at the dark garden below. The frost was forming on the grass. She could not see it, but she knew it was there. She had done the right thing. She was quite certain of that. The trust would stand, the tenants would be protected, and whatever Wentworth did next, he would not be able to undo what she had signed. She had done the right thing, and she had no house and no formal position, and a small income that would house her adequately but not generously. And the sensation in her chest was not grief exactly. It was something quieter. The feeling of a thing completed, and another thing not yet begun. She thought about the miniature in Calloway's breast pocket. She thought about a drawer somewhere in Calloway Hall that did not yet exist, and then she stopped thinking about it, because it was not useful, and she had a habit of not thinking about things that were not useful. She lit the lamp. She opened the estate accounts to the Eastfield column and made 3 notations about the drainage outlet and 1 about the supply of sand for the coming February work, and she wrote them in her usual hand, neat and level, and she did not think about anything else until the house was fully quiet. What she did not know, upstairs in her room with the cold pressing at the window glass, was that Calloway had received Mr. Peel at 6 o'clock that evening. And she did not know that Peel had brought with him the completed register of the trust, with all signatures, and that Calloway had read it in its entirety at his desk by lamplight, with an expression that his housekeeper, passing the open study door, later described as a man finally understanding something he had known for a long time without knowing he knew it. He arrived at Thornfield at 10 o'clock on Saturday morning. Eleanor heard the carriage from the upstairs landing and looked out the window and saw Calloway's vehicle, and, behind it, Peel's elderly gray cob. She came downstairs at a measured pace, smoothing her gray-green wool gown, because the household had no right to her agitation, and she had no habit of displaying it in any case. They were already in the entrance hall. Calloway had not sent his card ahead. He had come without announcement the way he did all necessary things, and he had found Wentworth in the hall by coincidence, Wentworth having just descended for breakfast, and the 2 men were standing in that particular arrangement that 2 men of equal self-possession produce when neither has decided yet whether to be pleasant. Mrs. Vane appeared at the top of the stairs, having heard the carriage. Mr. Peel stood near the door in his overcoat holding a leather document case. "Calloway," said Wentworth, with the mild surprise of a man who considers neighbors a class of intrusion. "What brings you here?" "A legal matter," Calloway said. His voice was level. He did not look at Eleanor, who had stopped on the bottom stair. He looked at Wentworth with the direct composure of a man who has not come to debate. "I have Mr. Peel with me. I would suggest we use the drawing room." Wentworth's solicitor appeared from the breakfast room, hearing the name Peel, and within 4 minutes all of them were assembled in the drawing room where the fire, Eleanor noted, was burning well, because Mrs. Joffre Vane had ordered it built up the evening before, the drawing room. The same room where she had stood at the window and watched the bay horses come up the drive. The same room where she had 2 years prior heard Wentworth call her the caretaker wife. "Sir Wentworth." "Mr. Dodder." Peel said, when they had all settled, and not settled, "I am here as trustee of the Thornfield Park Charitable Settlement, executed in March of this year under an instrument I witnessed and registered with the county court. The settlement transfers the freehold of Thornfield Park, its outbuildings, its attached farmland, and its tenanted cottages to a board of trustees for the perpetual benefit of the 17 tenant families currently residing on the property. Wentworth looked at Peel. He looked at Peel with the expression of a man who has been told a thing in a language he does not speak and is waiting for the translation. "I beg your pardon," he said. "The transfer was executed by Mrs. Ashby, under the authority of the marriage settlement clause pertaining to a trustee wife in cases of prolonged spousal absence," Peel continued, in the measured voice of a man who is prepared for this conversation. "Your legal counsel will find the relevant clause on page 14 of the original settlement. You were absent from Thornfield for 143 days in the year preceding the transfer. The threshold is 60. Wentworth's solicitor had already crossed the room to Peel's document case. There was a silence that had the texture of cloth tearing somewhere a room away. Mrs. Vane stood very still near the fireplace. Her composed expression had not changed exactly, but the confidence underneath it had shifted to something with more edges. Wentworth looked at Eleanor. He had come to Eleanor at last. "You signed away Thornfield," he said. Not an accusation, yet a statement. The word "yet" was doing its work. She met his eyes. She had not looked away from him in 5 years. Not when it would have been easier. Not when the looking had cost her. She did not look away now. "I signed Thornfield into a trust that ensures the families who have worked this land for 3 generations cannot be displaced from it to satisfy a private debt," she said. "Yes." Wentworth's face moved through several arrangements. His solicitor spoke to him in a low voice. He shook it off. Calloway had been standing slightly apart, near the windows. He did not speak during this exchange. He had come to confirm the legal reality, not to conduct it. When Wentworth turned from Eleanor with an expression that was beginning to locate an object for its displeasure, Calloway crossed the room and stood so that he was between Wentworth and the space where Eleanor was standing. Not in front of her. Beside her. The distinction was exact. "Eleanor Ashby is the only legal owner of Thornfield Park," he said, looking at Wentworth. The words were level and precise, and not raised in volume by a single degree. In her capacity as trustee, she made a legal and binding disposition of that ownership. There is nothing here to reverse. The drawing room had the particular quality of held breath that comes when several people in a confined space have all arrived at the same understanding at slightly different moments. Samuel, the footman, who had been sent to bring in coals and had remained frozen near the door, understood it. The housekeeper, Mrs. Bettis, Crane, who had appeared in the doorway behind him with a tray she was not now going to deliver, understood it. Mrs. Vane, whose composed expression had not shifted outwardly, understood it with a specific and private knowledge that showed only in the very small stillness of her hands at her sides. Wentworth's solicitor understood it, and was already opening the document case again with the mechanical resignation of a man who knows that what he is about to read is not going to improve the situation. Wentworth looked at him. Wentworth looked at Mrs. Vane. Mrs. Vane looked at the fire. Wentworth's solicitor closed the document case. The scene that followed was procedural rather than dramatic, which was the only kind of scene that could actually close something like this. Wentworth's solicitor confirmed, page by page, what Peel already knew. The trust was registered and valid. The instrument had been properly executed. The marriage settlement clause was unambiguous. Mrs. Vane said very little. She said it with the composure of a woman who has understood that composure is the only dignity available to her, and Eleanor found she did not despise her for it. Mrs. Vane had believed a promise. The promise had been made in bad faith. Those were not the same thing. By noon, Wentworth's second carriage was being loaded again. He spoke to Eleanor once more before he left, in the hallway. Alone. He said, in a voice that was quieter than she had expected, "I did not think you had it in you." She thought about 5 years of account books, and drainage ditches and estate correspondence and 17 families whose names she knew and whose children's names she knew, and whose harvest yield she tracked in a column on the east page of the March ledger. She thought about a clause on page 14 of a marriage settlement that her father's solicitor, a meticulous and underestimated man, had inserted 29 years before she was born. "No," she said. "You did not." She watched his carriage go from the top step, the same step where she had watched Mrs. Vane arrive. The air was very cold and very clear, and the frost was beginning to thaw at the edges of the gravel, the way frost always did by midday, reliably and without any requirement of intervention. Lady Fenton had said it at the assembly rooms in October, to a woman Eleanor did not know but whose sharp intake of breath had carried across the floor. Poor Mrs. Ashby, forever the caretaker wife. Sir Wentworth has always required managing. And at the market in November, Calloway's own housekeeper had reported what was being said, relayed through Peel, who had thought he ought to mention it, that they were calling her the caretaker wife still, as though she never had a thought of her own. She had always required managing. She had managed. The difference between the thing they meant by that word and the thing she had done with it had simply never occurred to them. She had managed 17 families and 400 acres, and a set of accounts that balanced because she had made them balance, and a marriage that had failed in every dimension, except the legal, and the legal was the dimension that had mattered. The woman had said something in return that Eleanor had not caught. She had gone on dancing the figure with her partner, who had said nothing, because he did not know she had heard. She had always required managing. She had managed. The difference between the thing they meant by that word and the thing she had done with it had simply never occurred to them. Calloway came to stand beside her on the step. Mr. Peel had gone on ahead. The household had withdrawn. There was just the cold air and the empty drive and the last sound of the carriage wheels on the far gravel. "Where will you go?" he said. It was a real question. She had no house. The trust owned Thornfield. She had no retained interest. She had precisely the small income from her father's estate that had seemed adequate for a country life 27 years ago, and had shrunk accordingly in the intervening decades. "I have not," she said, entirely decided. He was quiet for a moment. The frost continued to thaw along the gravel edge, each degree at its own pace. "The trust requires a resident manager," he said, "someone with knowledge of the property and the tenants. The position would include the use of the west wing and a reasonable income from the trust's revenues." She looked at him. He was looking at the drive. The crease between his brows was present, which meant he was not as composed as he appeared. "That is a very convenient arrangement," she said. "I thought so," he said. Another moment. The cold pressed at her temples. Somewhere in the east field, the drainage ditch was running clear. "You understand," she said carefully, "that if I were to accept a resident position at Thornfield, I would be accepting it on my own terms, not as a caretaker." He turned and looked at her. Then he looked at her with the quality of attention that she had spent 4 years carefully not naming, and his expression was the expression of a man who has made a decision at 9 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday and intends to live by it. "I would expect no less," he said. It was not until 2 weeks later that he used her name. Not Mrs. Ashby Eleanor. He said it standing in the small sitting room that looked over the kitchen garden, which was where they seemed to arrive when the evening grew late and the fire was warm and the conversation had moved past the point where formal address was doing any work. He said it the way he said most things, quietly and with a precision that suggested he had chosen this particular moment for this particular word, which she was quite certain he had. Those 2 weeks had not been idle. The district had registered an opinion as it always did, though the opinion had shifted. Lady Fenton had called on Tuesday, with a slightly different manner than she had ever employed before, one that suggested she was recalibrating the account she had been keeping of her all these years. Peel had brought the formal trustee correspondence and stayed for tea and said without being asked that the settlement was absolutely secure, and that Wentworth had not, and would not, contest it, because contesting it would require him to admit in writing what he had attempted to do. Mrs. Vane had not called. Eleanor did not expect her to, and bore her no particular ill will. A woman who had believed a promise was not the same as the man who had made it, knowing he could not keep it. Calloway had called on Wednesday, and on Saturday, and on the following Tuesday, each time with some small practical pretext that neither of them mentioned after the first minute, and both of them understood as something else. He was not pressing, he was not withdrawing. He was doing what she was doing, which was making his presence a fact, without making demands of it, and she found that she was glad of his company, with a plainness and directness that surprised her, because for 5 years, gladness of that kind had felt like something she was not entitled to. "Eleanor," he said. And then he did not say anything further for a moment, because the name itself was the thing he had wanted to say. She felt the warmth behind her sternum that she had spent 4 years carefully disregarding. She did not disregard it this time. She allowed it to exist in the room along with the fire and the darkness of the winter garden, outside, and Calloway sitting across the small table with his hands at rest and his dark eyes on her face. "Yes," she said. He reached into his coat pocket and set the miniature on the table. Not between them, as he had the first time. He set it to the side, and then he stood and crossed to the writing desk in the corner of the room and opened the small central drawer and placed the miniature inside, carefully, and closed the drawer. He stood for a moment with his hand on the closed drawer. The fire shifted and settled behind him. Then he came back to the table and sat down, and his hand was an inch from hers on the green wool of the tablecloth, and neither of them moved toward it, and neither of them moved away, because there was no need yet to arrive, when the beginning was already everything the beginning should be. Old Birch, passing the lit window on his way home from the evening rounds, saw the two of them at the table in the warm room. He did not stop. He went on across the frost toward his own cottage, his hands in his coat pockets, his breath a small cloud in the December air, and if he was smiling at something, there was no one in the dark to observe it. The kitchen garden was rimed with frost. The east field drainage ran quietly, where it was supposed to run. The house was warm and lit and entirely hers. And inside, in a small drawer in the corner of the West Wing sitting room, a miniature of a fair-haired woman rested quietly in the dark, at peace. Thank you for sitting with Eleanor's story. If it moved you, leave a word in the comments. Those responses mean more than you might think. E.